So welcome to the July 26 meeting of the CNCF IoT Edge Working Group. On the agenda today, we've got a couple items involving the Edge Native white paper. One is discussing another round of reviews, and somebody on the call just made note of some comments before we formally started. So maybe I'll invite you to bring that up again so it makes it into the recording. And then we also have a second related agenda item of promoting this Edge Native white paper at the Kubernetes KubeCon North America event in whatever opportunities might be available to do that. So maybe let's go to the first thing I mentioned in the second item in the written agenda, which is the comments related to LF Edge. Do you want to restate that again, just so we get it in the recording?
Yeah, so I have so the LF Edge, they actually have an annual State of the Edge meeting and publication. So even if that overall is not that active, but there actually is ongoing discussion about the State of Edge. So I have reviewed a lot of information. There's still a lot of good information there. I added one comment to the white paper, and I believe there are many more to be added. I started, that one comment I had is about the, actually, can you bring it out? I'm actually looking at it. I cannot, from my phone, actually, I'm calling from, I don't see that my comment. So basically, the papers right now says that about the statelessness of the edge computing, right? So I believe if you look at the 12-factor app, there are two. One is being stateless, the other one is backing service. So I believe in the cloud, assumption is the backing service being whether it's AWS S3 or a cloud native database, like not cloud native database, just database services available in a cloud. Those are why you can actually have a stateless application, right? So in the edge, then that service, that backing service, is also part of the whole ecosystem. So to say that the edge is fully stateless, probably need to be re-evaluated because backing service is also there. I think that's my comment. Any thought about that?
Well, I think I've got a very similar comment in the paper now about statelessness at Edge. So I don't know. I have to say I agree with you. Let's see, I don't know exactly. It's under the data persistence section of that document. If you scroll down, I don't know, the equivalent of a page or so. So I don't know, there already has been a comment like that. And, there are limits to how big we want this document to be, like it's a white paper, not a white book. And I think, as long as there's an acknowledgement of the fact that things going on at Edge, they vary. There might well be some things at the Edge that could afford to be fully stateless. But, on the other hand, I know plenty of use cases where people are looking for some solution to store state at the Edge. There might be a good argument, just like the backing store is done in a public cloud, to segregate those cleanly so that you don't have persistence being implemented over and over again in a bunch of different places, and that maybe you could come up with a scenario to put a clean abstraction layer over where this persistent storage is so that you can at least find it and maybe implement variable solutions as technology advances over time. How deep we want to go to in this white paper, other than calling attention to people's awareness that this is a recognized issue. And I don't know that we want to produce the laundry list of every possible solution to stateful on Edge. just because once again, it can get too big. And the other danger is these kinds of things in technology get stale and would have to be maintained. So if you purport that this paper gives you the authoritative, definitive list of every possible solution for stateful on the edge, you're signing up to maintain this, and maybe you don't want to go there rather than have it being a longer lived document. Andy, maybe I'll let you make some comments, but we have discussed this before.
Yeah, I think it's all good points, and I think it's you can hear me, right? Yeah. So I think it's all good points, and I think the idea here is that, again, and this just backs up what Steve says, but I'll try not to repeat what he said verbatim. I think the notion of us being more of a preferences or traps for young players, things that you should try and avoid. I think it's more of that type of guidance. In the case of data persistence, I think it's depending on your definition of an edge, which I have to switch hats many times from my work with IBM Research versus my work in this specific working group. When we talk about edge here in this working group, we talk about very small constrained devices for the most part that are capable of a limited subset of things and potentially could do more if they were given more maybe they were given GPUs, they could potentially contribute to building, models for AI processing and so forth, right? But they're intended to play a part as a larger part of orchestration rather than being the hub, and I use that term loosely, the hub of things that need to be done in order to complete a workflow. They are intended to be leaf nodes for providing information and doing some level of execution, but not to own entire workflows necessarily. So if you take it from that standpoint, the recommendation that we make is that the degree to which you leave information on those edge locations should be limited to their use case and not necessarily go beyond that point, because the degree of reliability for either their existence on the network or their connectivity to the network may change over time. And so the guidance we'd like to give is that it would be better if you did not keep information that was intended to be kept for longer periods of time statically at an edge. And that's just the recommendation that we thought was fair.
Yeah, I actually agree on that. If you look at my comment, yeah, I actually saw you, Steve. Yeah, it's on the same line, basically your comment. Definitely we shouldn't be like any technology specific. For example, the example I give in the comment is AWS, the Snow family, right? So some of the Snow Edge that have actually a local kind of AWS S3 service, which serves as I believe is like a local backend service. So whatever you do, the actual data will be saved on there, right? So there are actually in the RF Edge community, there are other research really going into the details on each category. For example, when it comes to data, there's two kinds of data. There's system data and user data, right? So their user data, I believe that's what Andy's talking about. Like if you record a video and you don't necessarily care whether it's lost or not, it can be either captured, or even if it's lost, the problem is not big deal, right? But there are also system data, which is critical for if the server goes down, if you need to rebuild the whole environment, that system data need to be sort of protected. So this way, when you need to restart the whole, if it's Kubernetes cluster, that system data need to be durable. Otherwise, that site will go down, right? So there are things like that that need to be further discussed.
You're muted, Steve.
Victor, I agree with you, but I don't see your comment in the document. So maybe you want to check whether that comment got uploaded in the Google Docs system somehow. Sometimes if you're disconnected or not logged in, it doesn't push it up to the cloud copy.
Actually, I'm pretty sure I put in there, but I'm actually logged in from my phone right now. I don't see it either.
Okay, well, check it later then, because I don't see your comment if it's in that data persistence
Yeah,
section.
it's,
I
at,
just don't
it's
see it.
higher than that. It's up at the title of the document.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay,
that's true.
now I
Yeah.
see it. Got it.
Yeah, and I
Um,
see the information about Snowball.
Yeah, the one thing, Andy, I think that still is maybe a little strong. I'll just directly read it under data protection or data
Yeah.
persistence. Any data that needs to persist
Yeah,
must be
yeah.
stored. I think the word must is just a little too strong. Tone it down to at least imply that this isn't like delivered in stone tablets from the mountaintop, and that there might be some exceptions. And because otherwise, I think you're just going to get a
updated the
recurring pattern of
terminology
people.
there.
Yeah.
Would the word can be acceptable?
Yeah, or even recommended, or there's
Okay.
a preference that it is something along that. Well, you can figure it out. We don't need to come up with the exact thing in this, but just as a point, pretty obviously there's tiny little amounts that pretty clearly are persistent. Like if you've got edge hardware that has a TPM holding securely your keys and things like that, those things are clearly persisted on the device. So it isn't a situation where there is zero persisted data. I think in a secure environment, there's almost always going to be some tiny, albeit a tiny amount, but there's going to be some. And you just want to reduce the amount of this storage to what is possible for your use case.
Yeah, and I think that's useful. I think really at this point, Steve, I think a lot of the points are there. I would argue that it is a matter of wordsmithing at this point to make things more recommendation based than static and structured. And I do agree with those. So when I hear the types of feedback that I'm getting, it points me to that the recommendations are I think fairly considerate of the domain, and there may be other points that would explode this into a much larger document if we let it.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it is a fair amount of coverage, and we can restructure it to be more of recommendations rather than edicts. I'm okay with that.
Yeah, this one in particular, like I say, you've now got a few comments, and frankly, my recollection is that when the 12 factors came out over 10 years ago now, the data persistent thing has been a perpetual hotspot that I've been to numerous conferences where that was outright ridiculed by speakers. In fact, one of them was me. And, it's probably a clue that the ironclad rule of no persistence maybe is controversial, depending on your app.
Yeah, and you've everybody's here has been forthcoming about bringing this up time and time again. And so I don't know that I don't have any strong belief that it is contrary to what you're stating. I think it's just a matter of softening the language slightly to make it more.
Okay, great. Yeah, and at some point, I think we've been now discussing this. What is it? 6 months is maybe longer. It's probably time to move on and get it published. And segueing into point 2 on the agenda of building awareness that this document even exists at the KubeCon North America conference, which is in early November. So I don't want to cut it short. If anybody wants to jump on the mic, unmute your, Tamoy, I see, I thought it was a hand raised, but it's a thumbs up. But any last minute comments on the document itself? Otherwise, we'll move on to plans to publicize this and declare it either a version 1 publication or a version or publication of the draft to the general public. Okay. So I think at the last meeting, we discussed a possible opportunity to bring this up in a KubeCon maintainer track session, but unfortunately, we have now missed the window for getting a maintainer track session. For those not aware, with the KubeCon logistics, there's the main body of KubeCon, which is KubeCon itself, and it's now been shortened to last 3 days. And long ago, working groups and projects used to be able to apply for these maintainer track sessions and have a very high probability of being given a slot to talk for, the standard slot length, which is like 35 minutes plus Q&A now. For the past year, they've cut that back to make these not so automatic, and you can get in there and put out a CFP and apply for one with no guarantee that it would be granted. But we had the opportunity to do it and missed it. And we still have another venue, which is the Kubernetes on the Edge Day. So this is a pre-event to KubeCon. It is, these day one events are extra costs. So when you register, you have to pay a little extra to be able to attend those day one events. And they tend to be half day or full day focused sessions on particular use cases or niches. And there is one devoted to Kubernetes on the Edge. This has, ever since they started doing these Kubernetes on the Edge days, they've been one of the more popular pre-events, getting hundreds of people attending. And the CFPs for that are still open for at least another week. I think it's the due date on CFPs is in August. On top of that, there's a group of people who volunteer to be on the organizing committee for those pre-events. And there is typically an opening keynote as well as a closing address. Those two are pretty short, but historically we've used those to, particularly the close, is something where we deliver some slides on activity within this group to build awareness so that people are aware that this group even exists. We tell them where the meetings are, how they can get involved. And I believe we have called out that previous white paper we did, so we could do it again. And this would be short. We still haven't come up with the firm time slots for this. So the process involved with this Kubernetes on the Edge Day is that people volunteer, the CNCF goes over the volunteer list and selects people to be on the program committee. They review all of the CFPs and independently vote on them with a consolidation process to pick the final agenda. And then the group would pick opening and closing speakers, although sometimes, I think there's been one time when a CNCF executive asked to step in and give the opening keynote. So that has happened too. But I think we'll have an opportunity to build awareness of this paper at the Kubernetes on the Edge Day event. It isn't fully resolved yet because we technically don't have the schedule posted, but I think I'd have a pretty high level of confidence that we can get this in there. This opportunity would probably be to just put up 2 or 3 slides, kind of a lightning talk kind of thing, that wouldn't read somebody the paper, but would tell them that it exists, maybe quickly show it on the screen and give them the link on where to go to get this and find more. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to put up a QR code. And then that would end up being preserved in the recording for the event. And historically, the recordings of this event get a lot of eyeballs. I haven't looked at the last one in Europe, but a month after the event, I think some of those sessions had 400 views. So they get a pretty high level of visibility. Probably the recording gets more total eyeballs than number of people actually in the room at the event.
Yeah, I mean, based upon your comments, I wanted to be clear and upfront, transparent about I hadn't been pushing for any other track. And the reason why these sound like reasonable ways or outlets to work with is because I'm already, like most of us here that are attending, we're already at the 2 talk limit.
Right.
So I could go ahead and say, hey, yeah, let's put a session together, but I'd have nobody to present
Yeah.
it. So
Let me suggest this idea. It's almost like this is a good idea as a collateral document whenever we publish a white paper, is just prepare like 3 slides to
yeah, we have
allow
that.
some generic speaker to promote the white paper.
Yeah, we
Because
have
I think,
the beginnings of that. Yeah.
okay, because this is something that could be reused over and over again. I know if I was at a conference or even a Zoom meeting, depending on the content, I'd be happy to propose that. And then maybe if we get that slide deck, Andy, you can do a trial run presentation of it to this group for comments.
Okay.
So, we can perfect the delivery of it, but that seems like that should be a pretty good way to do it. And then once we have that slide deck, whoever ends up taking on the closing for that Kubernetes on the Edge day, it's a simple matter to just tell them, hey, here's some slides mentioning the deck. Do you think, use your own judgment since you're the speaker, but if you like it, maybe consider going and delivering this to the audience. And I think that.
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, I can certainly expand upon what we have now and make sure it's inclusive of the highlights. And then we can do a trial run of it here next time we meet, if you'd like.
Okay, sounds good. And I'd be happy if you want a reviewer, just send me a link to it when it's there. We can just put, probably a good way to do it to allow future speakers to easily get to it is just throw it up there as a shared Google slide deck or something, and they can be cut and pasted into somebody whoever might want to use it in the future.
Okay, yeah, I think that's fair. That's good advice, and I'll take that. I said we already had something to do the introduction, and so now I'll just put the finer points and some high level points in there, and I'll run it by you.
And Frederick, I know you've got a lot of experience in similar things because you've been involved in white papers and even promoting books and other things. If you've got any ideas on how we can, recommendations on how we might go about making the world aware of this.
That's a good question, but depending on what target audience you have, but certainly having one or several webinars or maybe a panel, custom made for the occasion would be a good idea. Maybe you bring a few of the authors, moderated by you, Steve, or even I would be happy to play that role, maybe if you want an outsider, so to speak. That's a great way to get additional mileage of good content. Apart from that, well, one strategy that we use for some content was to have as well. Slice and dice it in different ways and publish it somewhere else, or you pick interesting chunks of it, and then maybe in a different medium. Let's say in our case, we literally created a publication on medium.com, and we had short form versions of some of the main points, and always pointing back to the full document and things like that. So those are two maybe tools. I'm not saying that you should create a publication on medium.com, but if you have channels where you could push those thought leadership pieces that send back to the fuller content, I think that's another strategy that worked well for us.
Yeah, in fact, maybe we should cross over, because I think if we get 3 slides, I'm guessing maybe you wouldn't mind us presenting that in your Eclipse IoT Edge working group meeting.
Of course.
Victor, if you're on LF Edge, I think LF Edge might have meetings as well. So maybe we could do crossovers to other open source groups. The other thing, thanks for reminding me, but the CNCF actually has a webinar series that you can sign up for. I think the queue for that is about 6 months, but we could get in the queue and give a presentation as part of that series that would likely come out after KubeCon, but nothing wrong with that. But that could be used to build awareness as well.
And LF Edge has its own series as well, I think, which is separate. So that's another channel, maybe.
Okay. Okay, that sounds good. Any final remarks on this agenda item? Otherwise, we'll move on. Let me see what else, if anybody has added anything late. That's it. So in the typical fashion, then I'm going to declare that we're just going to
You're suddenly muted.
yeah, sorry. So I think we're out of the agenda items. So we'll morph this meeting into a general purpose birds of a feather freeform conversation. So I'd invite anybody who's come across anything interesting lately, like in the past couple of weeks or months, to just unmute yourself and tell us about it. It could be blog post, a YouTube video, whatever, or advances on some project you're working on.
Yeah, I think the Edge is very interesting. Actually, today I actually watched an interesting video about satellite security, which is, satellite is also IoT problem, right? So, yeah, I think it'll be it'll be interesting to actually let me share that video in the chat. So it will be, I think definitely that, the white paper, we can probably say that's just the first version. There'll be, a lot of interesting stuff, definitely, just like any technology in open source world. Probably it would be nice to have a dialogue actually, because the looks like what the RF Edge group does, they focus on more of the infrastructure for like 5G, mobile, etc. So they more come from a telecom provider perspective, whereas this group, more my understanding, is more from an application, like user perspective, rather than the provider, network provider perspective. But there'll be a certain point of a joint interest between the two community on how to leverage what they have. Right, for example, they have a very detailed matrix on what's available to build an edge network, right? Network computing. A lot of good information there, and they publish a state of the edge every year. But they, I believe, they also have trouble trying to promote that, what's available for users for companies, for organizations to adopt edge computing infrastructure. But I think what this group can actually help them by actually, the use cases that's really suitable for what they have. I think that's an interesting cross section of the two communities.
Yeah, Liam, you've got your hand raised.
I would be curious if you could tell us a little more about that matrix. I'm not familiar with it. I'm familiar with the LF Edge group, but if you could maybe drop a link in there, that would be amazing. Yeah,
let me see what I have that. Yeah, it's a matrix. So basically, they actually tells each component of that infrastructure what they are, like for example, the CNCF, right? In CNCF, there's so many different projects. So it's really hard sometimes to say what project does and how to choose the product. They actually sort of not resolving the problem, but make it easier for people to choose by defining the details of each project, sub-project, what they do. So let me see what I can find out, post in the chat.
Yeah, overall, this is personal opinion, but my characterization of these groups touching on edge-related open source are that you've got LF Edge, you've got the CNCF, and then you've got Frederick's organization, Eclipse Foundation. They sort of have niches, but there's a lot of overlap. And the CNCF started from cloud native. It's obviously in their name, but as users got attracted to the idea of using containers at the edge, and that expanded into things going even potentially beyond containers, because containers inspired a whole tool chain of things like OCI registries and collateral tools related to networking that also were applicable at the edge. It's something in the CNCF world where the edge space came down from cloud native, but has recently been recognizing that some of these things at Edge are almost polar opposite of what you've got going on in cloud native. The LF Edge, I think somebody mentioned, and I'd agree that it's largely telco focused, where the telco projects tend to live over there, but they took on other things as well that were maybe useful to these telco use cases and are valuable on their own. And they've got open source projects standing up over there. I know I'm personally familiar with secure device onboard, for example, the technology for delivering empty hardware from the factory and booting it up in a secure way to install OS and whatever else you might need. And there are projects living over there like that. Frederick, I'm going to give my bias on Eclipse and I'll let you correct me, but I think that the projects living over there, you've kind of cornered the market on industrial IoT and some of the technologies related to that, where I think you've really got a strong presence there. But given that you've got 50 plus projects, there's a lot more as well. And from the perspective of a new open source project, I think if you had started an open source project related to the Edge, there's enough overlap that you might have a serious debate as to which of the organizations you might best fit in. And there's no one right answer. Maybe, Frederick, you could give the top level overview of Eclipse Edge.
Yeah, I can certainly cover that. And we, in fact, just shuffled things a bit around. But essentially, we've got something called Eclipse Edge Native, which is the gathering of people that really care about Edge. But we, given our past in development tools and developer-centric things, of course, we don't have so many projects that are pure infrastructure or things like that. In fact, the Edge platforms that we've got are really designed to work with Kubernetes or to orchestrators in the field, right? But they can work in standalone mode as well. And that's where our interest is, to have something that really embodies our philosophy for what we call edge ops, in the sense that, well, doing pure DevOps at the edge is a bit, it's a bit dangerous. So we try to have platforms that are really built from the ground up for the edge. The way the Eclipse Foundation typically operates is through a general concept called industry collaborations. And we have various things that, you know, belong to that category, such as working groups, interest groups. And anyway, I won't enter into the details of that, but in the end, what happens is that we have a complete decoupling between our open source projects and our working groups and other types of collaborations. So an open source project is always project lead, committers, and they set the technical direction that they want as a community, right? And the staff is there to support them. So we are member funded like the Linux Foundation is. So the money serves to deliver build servers and things like that. And of course, support staff like myself to accompany the projects. And on the other end, we have our collaborations. So in the case, let's say, of the Eclipse IoT Working Group, then this is a gathering of organizations that care about IoT and Edge, in the context of having a set of building blocks to build commercial platforms on the top, right? So most of our members do that. And the way this works is that projects decide which working groups they interact with, and working groups decide which projects they care about, right? So we have a number of projects that are relevant to both automotive and pure edge infrastructure. So they deal with those two distinct working groups, for example. So that's slightly different than from the LF Edge or Linux Foundation model, generally speaking, where the consortia and the project are, in most cases, the same. In our case, we decouple those two concepts, which means that you can start an Eclipse project without being an Eclipse member, for example. And we have a number of companies that do just that, and that's perfectly fine with us. So that's the short version of the way that we operate, let's say. And you are still muted, Steve, really?
Okay, so My summary is I think there are 3 major organizations, but not to leave anybody out. I think there's another one for WebAssembly. Tomoya is here, and there's another independent organization, I believe, for the robot operating system. And there are others out there as well. So I threw a link in the chat that is my attempt to summarize a list of open source projects related to Edge, and column 2 there is the sponsoring organization, if there is one. And I guess we left out Apache Foundation, but many of them are out there. Liam.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention is that outside the LF CNCF sphere, there are, dozens, if not hundreds of highly specialized work groups. You look at like the IEEE Power group is where, you find the big builders of power equipment, GE, Siemens, those kind of things. So I think that the definition that you find, the challenge that we continue to butt heads against in this meeting is defining the edge. It's a little bit more, I think you almost have to define the edge in the context and operating domain that you're in. Because, in the satellite, one of the ones mentioned earlier, you'd be dealing with the DDIL concept, which is the DoD acronym for what? The disconnected, disrupted, intermittently latent infrastructure, things like that. And in power and systems like that, you end up focusing on things that I think are a little bit more stateless in their definition. There is some intersection of needs. If we were to build a table, one of the features would probably be state or stateful. Another one would probably would be, you could like almost like a capability matrix for some of these various, themes of devices, whether it's power, satellite, all the way across, I think to kind of dial in and help that discussion happen a little bit more productively. Because I've always found that, and we continue to hit this, every week somebody says, well, depends on how you define edge. And then everybody has their own examples here. So I almost, maybe that would be something we could clear out of the way later.
Share that RF Edge taxonomy. So they have a very nice table. Really, I think it'd be nice that the CNCF community and have similar things for the CNCF projects.
Dan, I think you have your hand up too. And so does Mark.
So hi everybody. So just to add on that satellite thing, I found there was a open source and open embedded, I think, summit in Europe, in Prague somewhere, and I saw a talk. I can't find the talk at the moment, but I'll put it in the channel afterwards, where actually, as Liam was mentioning, there was a talk where how you can actually update software on satellites where you don't have the possibility of sending nothing more than 3 MBs or something over the uplink channel. So there are solutions out there where you just send the patch up to the satellite and the satellite then compiles your code. So yeah, it absolutely is the fact that it depends on application to application, depending on who's spending so much money, who's willing to spend a decent chunks of money on uplinks, downlinks, on persistence, on edge persistence. So it's completely oriented. And I think to make a note of certain things is the fact that edge computing has unfortunately become much more of a marketing term. So it has broadened its horizons, but on the other hand, it's also become a bit more key these days as to what edge is. And I see Mark is actually in the meeting. I think I remember a couple of months back, Mark was mentioning about how it's worth mentioning, at least in the community, about what are the potential alternatives to, dare I claim this blasphemy in Kubernetes meetings, but are there any alternative solutions to orchestrators out there that are probably, I don't know, maybe might be well suited for very constrained edge solutions? I think Andy might probably have some good opinions about it. And I was actually very curious about this because we do have flavors of Kubernetes, but What about other tools out there? I am not too sure much more about what that is, but yeah, might be interesting to have a discussion about this.
Yeah, I still wonder about that as well. To Steve's point, so I work with SUSE, and we have a solution to deploy an entire operating system, Kubernetes, and whatever your app is on top of all that, to the edge, and sort of this full stack solution. And yet there are parts of Kubernetes that work, there are parts that don't. And what I keep coming back to personally is that we have this term now, edge, but edge has been around forever. It's compute, it's networking, it's the storage. It's and what happened, in my opinion, is that we solved some of the compute problems in data centers by homogenizing everything and by creating network admins, and so I feel like edge needs to get back to just being compute, and we just need a solution for how do we get our applications out to the compute at the edge. And then some of these remote locations, some just need to be data producers and just need to pump data back to some other things. Some need to actually do compute and actually communicate with other things in that local space. Some of them, a satellite needs to have different functionality than a assembly line in a factory. And so I think that part of the challenge here is that we've kind of, with edge, we've exploded back to what used to be a problem, which is that, and edge also has devices that we seem to have really, we don't have that problem in the data center of all these sensors and actuators. So one of the things that I keep coming back to, and I know that Kubernetes solves some of these problems, but when when the edge just goes back to being those core components, how would we solve the problem? Can we come up with creative ways to getting everything below your application is overhead? And I think that's why with embedded systems, we just build the application into the system, and it's sort of been this set it and forget it mentality that no longer works. We need visibility into these things. We need them to communicate with other things. We need a higher level of control and security over these systems. How do we get there? Kubernetes right now is working for some, but not for others. And I think, so excited to always come in and talk to this group, because I think there's lots of interesting ideas going around about these problems.
We've got raised hands. Why don't you self-moderate and just jump in on the mic? And if it's a problem, then I'll impose more strict moderation. But people with the hands up, just
Andy, go right ahead.
And do paper, rock, scissors? No, you absolutely go.
Oh, sure, I'll go, Andy. Thank you. Look, I think that there are all of these reasons why execution's distributed, and some of the fundamental jobs to be done transcend, Kubernetes and the edge. Things that transcend both are, the need and desire to keep things up to date and secure, the need and desire to update things. Those are long-lived. But there's all of this focus on the edge because that is the next epic of computing. The last decade was this great lift and shift into the cloud. The next decade is bringing things out to the edge. And it's not just that's where the data is, it's latency and determinism. It is regulatory reasons, limited deliberate autonomy, or privacy and security. All of those reasons are fundamental reasons that we might easily come up with examples. I'm a skin checking ML app wants to keep a naked picture of Liam on my phone for everyone's sake, right? And defining those various edge devices, I think what's universal about them would be themes like mobility, remoteness, and that would be all we could agree on. Everything else would be a capability, including state, including persistence, network connectivity, offline, all of those other things on that axis and dimension. But I continue to come back to, and obviously I'm deeply immersed in the WebAssembly space, so I see a lot of WebAssembly nails. When you approach things, to see the enthusiasm and research coming out of the biggest producers of edge equipment, the Siemens of the world, folks like Tesla, both of them have blogged consistently about how they're adopting WebAssembly to solve some of these problems. And I'm going to put myself on the schedule for next week, and I'll do whatever the group wants. I'll do. I did a talk for the Open Source Summit where I was like WASM WTF, and I'll do a WASM WTF and talk through like the big ideas, the standards, and then where is WebAssembly today. We actually just yesterday published the WebAssembly roadmap on the Bytecode Alliance blog. If you didn't see that yet, we produced a nice 15-minute YouTube video to walk through all of the things. But I think what we're going to do in a follow-up post is, what does this mean? And I think that's the post that this group would find most interesting, and that's what I can touch base on next week. So assuming I can double check my schedule, but I think it works. I don't know how much time I can plan to spend. I could spend as much or as little as people want. We just want to dial that in, 15 minutes or 30, and I'll get everybody up to speed on what are the standards, who's using it, what are the great reference use cases like Amazon Prime Video, and then maybe point you at like a whole bunch of projects, including the ones I work on in the CNCF that are cool and about WASM. Does that sound good?
It sounds great to me, Liam, and maybe take the full 30 minutes you suggested and then leave some time for freeform discussion, Q&A afterward. And maybe we'll have some other group members come and tack on a little bit too. I know Kate isn't here today, but she works in the WebAssembly space, and maybe we'll invite a few other people to follow you up or something.
I have some folks that I'd like to invite to that. So I'm going to look, I know one in particular that would be really excited to see more about this.
I'll link the roadmap, which we put a ton of work into this roadmap. It includes all the key sort of projects across the WebAssembly ecosystem, where we need help, what's going well, what's being committed now, what happens before KubeCon, what happens before the end of the year, and then I'll do some of the interpretation of hey, what does resource handles or file system virtualization, what does that mean? You're now able to do with WebAssembly, and then I can also, as much as it's public, like Amazon has been very vocal about their WebAssembly use. They did a great blog about how they use WebAssembly to deliver Amazon Prime Video to over 8,000 unique devices. I can point you at some of their stuff, what's important to them, like they've been driving a lot of the adoption of threads into WebAssembly, and really try to tell a comprehensive story to get everybody up to speed, because this is incredible stuff and it's moving at a lightning pace. What we could really need is just more smart people that bring their diverse ideas and perspectives to the table.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to it.
Andy, you want to go ahead? Did you have your hand raised?
So I think one of the things I wanted to mention is, and it's an area that's been of interest for me for a while, and as an extension of the open source project I represent, Kubestellar, is that we had this idea right out of the gate of supporting hub and spoke, the ability to deploy things across multiple clusters, whereas Kubernetes, you can't do that by default, right? You do that in a single cluster with multiple nodes, but you don't do it across clusters. So that's what Kubestellar is good at. But going ahead it's all, I think where we get to is this idea of not depending on a single hierarchy that starts at the top and ends at the bottom. And so I don't see Edge so much as a leaf node. So I want to be careful here. The paper that I've been helping and contributing to on Edge native application behaviors is not the hat that I'm wearing right now. I'm wearing this is the next phase of things. So I think in the next phase is this connection between what is considered traditionally as a hub and what is a spoke, and that an edge could be very well responsible for directing workload. and probably should be. There should be this interactivity up and down the stack rather than there being, you know, a single one-way specification being sent down to be done. It may be that specifications go northbound as well. Why not? And so I think you're getting into, you know, specifics about, well, how do we regulate? And I think that's really important. We're starting to look at that with folks around the globe in the open source for compliance and other matters. But there's also the idea of observabilities, because when you get into this idea of processing or pre-processing AI models at scale, where you need access to multiple clusters that have varying degrees of capabilities, whether it be GPU, CPU, whether it be a matter of cost or carbon intensity, you're talking more or less about understanding at the bare minimum, did my job run? That's what people are interested in. Did my job run? I see there's a number of clusters available. Why didn't my job run? If it hasn't, or why has it been preempted? And so there's different viewpoints, but they all come back to that basics of, well, let's make sure that we influence a job to run in the space where it needs to run based on constraints, whether they be compliance or carbon or cost or any other matter, any other factor. And then let's also have some observability. And both of those things require respect and honor for the constraints that you send to the given edge cluster, and then even some feedback that has to come upstream to say, I didn't get to this, or I couldn't do this because of a specific constraint, or I'd like to see someone else do this because I'm not in a state where I can execute. So I think there has to be a little bit more, you know, in the past, what we looked at from Kubernetes is a very simplex, you know, top-down approach to how jobs and execution of workloads happens. I think in the future, we need that to be duplex, where things happen up and down the stack. And then that's where I'm headed with Kubestellar.
To add to, I think what Liam was mentioning, I'm looking forward to the WASM thing, because from my personal experience, at least with customers who have some insanely high remote, so to say, infrastructure, I think it becomes quite a big bit of an hassle when it comes to working with CNCF tools at times, because the air gap situations sometimes become extremely difficult to bridge. Even though you have, let's say, you might have a very mighty so-called powerful edge somewhere that does talk to your constrained leaf nodes, but at some point of time it starts to break because it just becomes burdensome. So I'm looking forward to having, if actually WASM actually can solve certain problems. What I'm actually curious about in this case would be if WASM itself requires a new form of orchestration logic. I mean, of course, it can piggyback on the container runtimes at the moment with some shims and everything, but would it be interesting to have something that goes from bottom up, and bottom up in the sense that we can come up with some ideas, what Mark's mentioning, and that goes up to the CNCF logic. Maybe Frederick might also have some projects out there in Eclipse who might be looking to add to these kind of things, because what I understand from at this point of time is having Kubernetes, full-blown Kubernetes, and then trying to strip it off to make it lean is not always the right solution. I'm not saying it's not wrong per se. It's generally, it works wonders for most scenarios, but in very specific cases, it starts to hit a wall, which is very difficult to overcome in certain cases. So I think it might be an interesting opinion to look into these kind of things where we can start to go from this bottom to top approach from this community all the way to CNCF on the long term.
Yeah. And I think that's moving away from that's what I was talking about basically, is moving away from the traditional top-down design of Kubernetes.
Right.
That's what we're looking at too.
Yeah, there are those, you mentioned whether WASM needs a new orchestrator, but there's plenty of people who voiced an opinion that even traditional Docker containers need a new orchestrator, depending on the use case. You know, when you look at it, Kubernetes was intended for this cloud hosted data center that had multiple servers that were homogeneous and you'd maximize efficiency by loading your workloads onto them to shoot for 100% utilization as a goal. You look at Edge, and there are certain Edge nodes that have enough resource for exactly one cluster node. And if you look at Kubernetes, so-called single node Kubernetes cluster, I think it's a legitimate question to ask yourself whether it makes sense if it is a Kubernetes node of one cluster. Granted, the attractiveness is that the tool chain is phenomenal. People are used to it. There's a lot of collateral tools and people are comfortable with its reliability and the health of the open source project. But some of the stuff that's going on there in a single node, like, you know, etcd raft consensus, if there's a single node, are you paying for something that is not delivering any value? Is the scheduler delivering any value? Legitimate questions. And maybe there are and probably should be alternate solutions. And in a big system approach that you're a worldwide organization or enterprise, I think there's plenty of room to be using both solutions. You know, Kubernetes at the top level for your cloud hosted. I think you're almost to a point where you're crazy not to be using it there. But when you get down to lower nodes, do you need the same exact kind of nail for every job, every place? Probably that's not the right engineering solution. So it turns into a hierarchy.
Yeah, we certainly are on the same page on that, Steve. And one particular segment of interest to our members in the Edge Native Working Group and Eclipse IoT Working Groups at Eclipse is everything that's related to safety critical, mission critical, real-time applications. I mean, even the Linux kernel with the preempt RT patches is not enough for part of that crowd, at least. So of course, adding the latency of a Kubernetes cluster on the top and containers and things like that means that you simply cannot do that, right? There's certainly a place for containers and container orchestration or even WebAssembly. But yeah, this whole segment of real-time, mission critical, safety critical is a bit forgotten in Edge conversations, but they are also Edge native applications in many cases. So
I apologize, my hand got pulled down a couple times there, but I just want to say that CNCF Wasm Cloud does WebAssembly orchestration that's compatible with Kubernetes, but not dependent upon it. So I'll demonstrate that next week when you think about an Edge native orchestrator. I'll also demonstrate the ML with a routable, routing ML to different nodes depending on privacy, availability, security, and those other things. That's something that we've done at ARM Summit, and BMW's done using Wasm Cloud before. So just as like a sneak peeks for next week. I also want to say that there's somebody in the Wasm Cloud community that's actually looking to port WebAssembly to Wind River RTOS. So to speak to your point around safety critical systems, I know that there's a huge bodies of work and prioritization happening in that area. One of the challenges there is that most of those, the real-time ARM cores, there's 3 different families, are only 32-bit ARM. So it has sort of a reduced availability for some of the tool chains. But I can speak to that next week a little bit when I chat about WebAssembly, and I'll put myself on the schedule then. Thank you.
Sounds great. And if you get it on the schedule, I'll cross promote it in a lot of communities, and I think a few people here will too. So we'll hope for a good turnout.
Yeah, I'll put it on right now. I can absolutely do it. So we do next week, Wednesday. It's the
well, it's actually not next week. We're on a 2-week cycle. So
okay, 2-week cycle. All right. So we're out. We'll be.
Let's see, August 9th. Right?
August 9th is perfect. If you're interested in WebAssembly, there's also WasmCon and the Bytecode Alliance WebAssembly Hackathon coming up.
That's in Seattle?
In Seattle, yeah. We just announced those. Those are linked off that blog post right off the Bytecode Alliance page that I put in the right earlier. That's got the WebAssembly roadmaps. Or did I link those? Here, I link those now. Here's the WebAssembly roadmap with the video walkthrough. But that's more like project updates across, there's hundreds of companies that work on WebAssembly, so that was quite a challenge to pull that together. But I'm very happy with how it came out. But 2 weeks. I'll put it on the schedule now.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve.
So-
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. We'll call this to a close then and see you in 2 weeks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.